Well, this is a great video to have strep throat and to also lose my microphone, but we're gonna, roll with it. Wellness is supposed to help us, so how has it become so dangerous? It's time for another book versus adaptation where I watch the adaptation, then read the book and decide which you'll like better based on the plot, characters, and relationships. But this one's gonna be a little bit different. Today, we're diving into The Woman Who Fooled the World by Nick Toscano and Bo Donnelly, and the Netflix adaptation Apple Cider Vinegar. More than just a comparison, this is also going to be a commentary on how the wellness industry has become a playground for pseudoscience, misinformation, and branding, and how that can literally cost lives. There will be spoilers for both the book and the adaptation, so if you don't want to be spoiled, please feel free to use the chapters down below to skip to my overall thoughts at the end. Please also be mindful that we're going to discuss some topics that may be triggering to some of you, including things like eating disorders, exploitations, miscarriages, and cancer. Before we dive in, I want to acknowledge something important. I know that some of you may have feelings about taking this kind of commentary from a fat woman, especially a fat woman that is currently so sick. And I want to be transparent about my own journey. Wellness has meant different things for me at different times. But for the past few years, it's meant doing things in all areas of my life. Physical, mental, social, financial, and environmental. And for me, that started by addressing my mental health, particularly addressing undiagnosed ADHD, which had been wreaking havoc on my relationship with food. Binge eating and sugar weren't just habits, they were the only thing giving my brain the dopamine that it craved. Now, I see a dietitian every 2 weeks. I walk and stretch daily. I do strength training twice a week because that's what fits into my schedule. And I still enjoy sweets sometimes. Because for me, wellness is about building a sustainable life. It's not about deprivation or performative health. And I share all this not to justify myself, but because I think it's crucial to approach these topics with honesty, context, and lived experience. Belle Gibson was an Australian wellness influencer who claimed to have cured her terminal brain cancer with natural remedies. She built a multi-million-dollar brand called The Whole Pantry, which included an app, a Penguin-published cookbook, and corporate partnerships. The Woman Who Fooled the World tells the story of her rise and fall from the journalists that actually cracked her story. The Netflix adaptation Apple Cider Vinegar takes this story and dramatizes it by adding character arcs for dramatic effect. Both versions reveal a really scary gray area between wellness and scams, and shines a light on the institutions that make it happen. Belle's lie was that she had terminal cancer and beat it without medicine, and she built a wellness empire off that lie. The book covers her calculated manipulations and the public's willingness to believe her claims. The show mirrors Belle's trajectory, but creates characters that didn't exist in real life to bring certain stories together into a cohesive arc, such as giving one of the journalists who's investigating the story a wife who is currently dying of cancer. And that really ramps up the emotional impact of the story. And both are really chilling in their own ways. Here's what I think was better in the book. Belle often preached transparency but never practiced it. The book explores this in depth, showing how her public message about honesty, accountability, and healing was completely at odds with her actual actions. Her brand was built on the idea that she was bearing her soul and being vulnerable, while behind the scenes she was meticulously controlling the narrative, manipulating people, and hiding the truth from her audience. The book more directly implicates corporations like Apple in giving credence to Belle's rise to fame. And it's kind of jarring to realize just how close they came to launching her app on millions of Apple Watches worldwide, until questions about her cancer diagnosis came to light. This wasn't just a personal grift. Major corporations were ready to give her the limelight, and their lack of due diligence speaks volumes for how easily branding can overshadow the truth. Belle's interactions with Mila's fiance at Mila's funeral was a lot more respectful in real life than it was in the show. Now, I say that with a caveat here because Milla isn't actually a real life person, but they did create the character inspired by a real life person. In the show, Belle is portrayed as intruding on Milla's personal space, and it comes off in a way that feels sensational and exploitative. In reality, Belle asked Milla's fiancé for a private conversation and doesn't cross those boundaries in the same way like she does in the show. And this change makes her appear even more duplicitous than she already was. And while she absolutely manipulated the people around her, the dramatization risks missing the nuances of how subtly those manipulations could play out. Here's what I think was better in the adaptation. The show's miscarriage plot line is barely even mentioned in the book, but its inclusion adds a layered, disturbing emotional beat. It's subtle but clearly connected to the idea of bodily perfection, oftentimes promoted by the wellness industry. And it opens the conversation to eugenics, ableism, and who gets to be seen as worthy of care or survival. The show excels at emotional resonance. By centering the story around Belle and Milla's relationships with their partners, with each other, and with their audiences, it makes the impact of Belle's betrayal stand out in stark contrast to Milla's fervent belief in an alternative path that ultimately failed her. You feel the betrayal ripple out from everybody who believed Belle, and then pity for Milla, who fell for a similar lie. Side characters like Craig and Belle's mother are used to show systemic complicity. Craig represents the ordinary person swept up in the charm of a charismatic figure, while Belle's mother is the embodiment of generational dysfunction and opportunism. These portrayals turn abstract critiques into emotionally charged moments that stick with you. Here's what I think could have been better overall. The show avoids putting any explicit blame onto Apple or Penguin, even though both played a major role in Belle's real-life success. This softens the institutional critique and misses an opportunity to show how corporate interests are often willing to look the other way when a profit is going to be made. And I think because of that, we lost some of the impact that it could have had on today's audience, which I think is primed to learn about how corporations exploit normal people. The complicity of these corporations, especially Penguin, which published her cookbook, and Apple, which nearly preloaded her app onto millions of Apple Watches, is hinted at the adaptation, but never fully interrogated. Their involvement could have shown how profit-driven systems validate and amplify harmful individuals under the guise of inspiration. And I think that this is particularly jarring when taking into account that Apple's co-founder, Steve Jobs, died of pancreatic cancer that he tried to heal naturally, and that towards the end of his life, he mentioned that he regretted not turning to traditional medicine sooner. The book, while compelling for a nonfiction, relies more on narrative than data. It could have used some hard numbers, case studies, or more specific expert commentary to quantify how wellness misinformation leads to real-world harm, particularly with those with chronic illness, disabilities, or economic vulnerability. And that was definitely a missed opportunity. All right, let's move on to characters, starting with Milla Blake.
Milla.
She was diagnosed with cancer.
So she's consistently maintained. I have no reason to doubt her.
Because in her case, it's true.
Milla Blake is a fictionalized character inspired by the real-life figure Jess Ainscough. Her storyline does diverge in significant ways. For example, Milla actually goes into remission at first, whereas Jess never did. This narrative choice adds complexity and emotional depth to the adaptation by allowing the viewer to see how hope and belief can be manipulated in dangerous ways. One of the most poignant aspects of Milla's arc is her guilt over her mother's death. When her mother is diagnosed with cancer, Milla directly influences her mother's medical decisions, and that leads to tragedy. And that guilt becomes a major emotional driver in the story. It's a smart move by the show to personalize the stakes and move beyond mere fraud into the realm of ethical complicity. Belle's partner Craig is given much more depth and emotional clarity in the show than in the book. The book leaves his involvement murky, probably to avoid defamation. The show portrays him as a man caught between love, duty, and disbelief. He tries to protect Belle's son and hold the family together, even as he becomes increasingly aware of her deception. His pain is palpable. You see him wrestle with what it means to support someone you love when that love becomes a lie. His presence grounds the show and gives the viewer a character to empathize with. Belle herself is portrayed as much more psychologically complex in the book. The book opens with an emotionally charged breakdown that immediately humanizes her. In both the book and the show, we learn about her troubled childhood, the rejection she experienced, and the way compulsive lying became a coping mechanism. These layers don't excuse her actions, but they do help explain them. In contrast, the show paints Belle as incredibly manipulative from the start.
Belle doesn't have friends. She has hosts.
She's driven by her need for attention and control. Her relationships are transactional and her apologies ring hollow. And this is in both the show and in real life. She surrounds herself only with people who can elevate her brand and discounts people who question her narrative. Both portrayals are chilling, but they both allow you to see the damaged child beneath the manipulative adult. And that does complicate your emotional response. All right, let's talk about relationships because this was a doozy in that area. We're going to start with the formative relationship, Belle and her mother. This relationship is one of the most disturbing elements in both versions. There are strong implications of Munchausen, where illness becomes a currency for attention and control. Belle's mother and stepfather seem less concerned with health and their daughter than by manipulating her story for their personal gain. It's a chilling look at generational dysfunction and how cycles of manipulation are perpetuated. So let's shift focus a little bit and talk about Belle and Ollie. In real life, Belle was often viewed as a more attentive mother than she is in the show. The show amps up the emotional stakes by making Ollie increasingly more anxious about the state of his mother's health, and for good reason. Seeing a child sense that something is wrong but being completely unable to do anything about it is devastating. The show does an excellent job about getting the audience to consider what it really means to be present for your child, not just physically, but emotionally and morally. All right, let's move on to the romantic relationship, Belle and Craig. The show makes it crystal clear that for Belle, this relationship is transactional. She leverages Craig's support for her own ends, and often sets him aside when he no longer serves her image. The book presents a more ambiguous dynamic, which leaves more room for interpretation but less clarity. What's most frustrating, though, is how the story ends. Belle faced no real legal consequences, and at the time of the book's publishing, she still hadn't paid a single cent of her very large court fee. The show seems to suggest that she had love all along, and that her lack of love was why she did what she did, which feels unearned and disingenuous given the magnitude of her deception and the way she holds Craig's love for her son over his head. Now, I do want to add a disclaimer here that this does talk about real life people. Please do not try to find anybody. This is just a commentary on the book and the adaptation. I have no idea what's happening now or anything along those lines. I do know that Belle was not compensated for either of these forms of media. But now let's move into my personal thoughts. Stories like Belle's wouldn't get traction without a society willing to believe them. And honestly, I get it. Observational trials, which are, let me read my definition here, studies where researchers observe the effects of a treatment without assigning participants to a specific intervention, can sometimes show promising results. But they are notoriously easy to misinterpret, especially without rigorous controls or peer review, something that actual medical studies have to have in order to gain any credence. Influencers often cite these studies without any context, and because they often sound science-y, they're often seen as proof. And it doesn't help that beauty standards and the wellness industry are so closely intertwined. One term that really sticks out here is orthorexia nervosa. And if you're not familiar with what that is, and while it's not officially in the DSM, it describes an unhealthy obsession with eating pure or clean foods that becomes increasingly more restrictive. And that is a form of disordered eating masked as wellness. Wellness influencers don't just normalize this, they celebrate it, and it's nothing to be celebrated. And we also have a cultural habit of believing people who look the part. Slim, glowing skin, a curated Instagram feed. These aesthetics can make a person's claim feel more trustworthy than an actual medical expert's, such as a licensed and trained dietitian. The wellness industry is built on pseudoscience and lies. And people have died because of that. I have always believed in the original meaning of wellness, that it should complement science and not replace it. That's why it's disturbing to see how wellness is being weaponized and politicized. RFK Jr.'s Make America Healthy Again platform pushes these ideas of wellness through alternative treatments, distrust of vaccines, the idea that government-backed science is inherently flawed. But this isn't just misguided, it's dangerous. RFK Jr.'s rhetoric taps directly into eugenics-based thinking. The idea that purity, whether genetic, physical, or ideological, can and should be pursued at all costs. He blames the rise in chronic illness from everything to vaccines and a rise in environmental toxins. But he does so without credible evidence. And it's the same kind of us versus them rhetoric that wellness influencers use. It's just scaled up a lot. It frames illness as a personal failure and health as a moral obligation, one that conveniently can only be gained by buying into his ideology. If you take anything away from this, let it be this. Don't confuse a polished story with the truth. Here's how to fact wellness claims. 1. Ask for peer-reviewed sources. If someone cites a study, look it up. See who funded it. Was it observational or randomized? You want the randomized study. 2. Check the credentials. Is the person a licensed professional, or are they speaking outside of their personal expertise? 3. Look for consensus. Is this one rogue study, or do major health organizations support the claim? 4. Beware of absolutes. If someone promises a cure or a miracle, that's a red flag. And lastly, trust your gut, but don't stop there. If something feels off, dig deeper. If you like this breakdown, I've got more book versus adaptation videos here. And since this whole video was essentially a political commentary, I'm not going to dig into freedom this week, but I will next video. Let's see what stories tomorrow brings.